I want you to have a look at this map that shows you all of the existing transportation, energy, and communications infrastructures that connect our cities, our societies, our nations together. And very often our maps neglect this infrastructure and the impact that it has on shaping relations between societies. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. If you look at the last 100 years in particular, and certainly into the future, as we'll do with some of these maps, you will see an incredible and astounding volume of connectivity that is being built, that is being laid down. And we have to take seriously all of that infrastructure and the consequences that it is going to have on geopolitics, on international relations. I actually liken all of this infrastructure, if you animate it over a 100-year time frame, it is like a skeleton that we as humankind are building on the physical surface of the planet Earth. That is called topographical engineering. And that is what we as a human civilization now have the engineering capability to do. And let's discuss what all of the consequences are. The first thing is to understand that the nature of geography is changing. It's becoming much more complex. No one disputes that a map of natural geography shows us the oceans, the continents, the forests, and the deserts. And of course, we take for granted that political geography, the geography of our nations and boundaries, has been the defining force in explaining how our societies interact with each other over the past centuries and even millennia. But today, there is a new layer, and that is this functional geography that I've been showing you. It is these three layers of geography together, not one being more important than the other, but the three as a very complex layering or cake that helps us understand just how complex the world is becoming. And that is going to become even more and more the case in the coming decades. Why? Because I'm sure you're familiar with all of the talk about the need for more stimulus spending, more fiscal policy, the need for more investment in infrastructure to create jobs, to cope with our growing global population that is reaching 8 billion people. Well, we have been living off of an infrastructure stock adequate to a world population that's more like 3 billion or 4 billion people. That's where we were a half a century ago. And so infrastructure spending is growing and growing and will continue to. And that is going to be very essential for societies to develop the basic services, transportation, again, energy, communications, and so forth, public housing, education, all of these things that allow us to cope with our world population. And that spending is going to grow and grow. Some project that it will reach about $8 trillion a year by the year 2025. And you can already see that so much of the world's infrastructure spending is happening in cities in particular. This is a map that shows you the entire distribution of the world's population. Every single person in this room, every human being in the world is a pixel on this map. You can see that what we truly are is a very increasingly urbanized civilization. Most of the world's population lives in cities. We tend to live along the coasts of the oceans or rivers, right? We gravitate towards bodies of water. And of course, the majority of the world's population now lives in Asia. What I've also done here is to highlight these ovals. These ovals are vast mega-city clusters. Some of them actually cross international boundaries, and they are the most dense and largest scale agglomerations that we have. Populations that range from maybe 10 million people all the way up to 80 or 90 million people in the case of where the Chongqing-Chengdu, for example, megacity cluster is going in central China, or the Pearl River Delta region of southern China. What you can also see from this map is how central each of these cities are to their national economies. In many cases, especially in developing countries, you will find that 50% or more of the GDP of an entire country rests on the economic activity of the population, the residents of just one city or of just one megacity cluster. What we're finding more and more is that, of course, the voice of the people in those cities, their interests, professional, business, social, and otherwise, are setting a national agenda. In some cases they do, in some cases they don't. But what we find more and more is that cities, if you will, the psychology of cities and the people who live in cities, particularly these coastal megacities, is that they favor, not only favor, but depend on, intrinsically, connectivity between them. Can anyone tell me what the exact GDP is of the city of Dubai that is independent of connectivity, of trade connectivity, financial, logistical, tourism, and so forth, from the rest of the world or from other cities? It is very, very difficult to disentangle these things. In the field of economics, we don't yet even have precise methodologies to really disentangle domestic from international, especially as we move into new kinds of the world economy, like services that are so geographically distributed. So people in cities and cities themselves, the leaders of cities, intrinsically know that they depend on this international connectivity. And the world becomes something of a civilization of connections across cities, again, a new layer on top of, coexisting with, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes in tension with the world of nations and states. Now, a lot of people today are very pessimistic about global trade. Not a day goes by where I don't hear the phrase, end of globalization, death of globalization, retrenchment of globalization. In fact, I recall hearing it after the tragic terrorist attacks of 9/11 in the United States. We heard it with the failure of the World Trade Organization Doha round to pass. We heard it with the financial crisis as well. But globalization is a process that rests on top of this extraordinary build-out of global infrastructure. It is something that is globalization is on top of that, and it may advance in some dimensions, recede in others, but it's something much larger than just any one statistic. But even if we just look at trade, trade is not ending, it is not disappearing, it is not fully reversing. In fact, if you really take an accounting of the growth of inter-regional economic relationships, it has been growing at an incredible velocity and to very significant volumes in particularly the last few decades. Look at the fact that the transatlantic economic relationship between the United States and Europe amounts to more than $1 trillion a year. And now, if you take European trade with Asia, take EU trade with China, EU trade with India, EU trade with the ASEAN region of Southeast Asia, with Japan, with Australia, that is greater than the transatlantic trade relationship. Trade between Asia and Africa has grown, between Africa and Latin America, between Latin America and Asia. These are today's facts in terms of just how strongly connectivity, globalization, global supply chains, the complementarities that societies have found with each other have accelerated and grown. This number may remain steady. It may advance more slowly. Some say that trade growth is decelerating with respect to the growth in world GDP, but trade is not disappearing. There are many parts of the world that are just starting to take advantage of the complementarities that they are finding with each other in energy markets or in capital flows. And remember that globalization isn't just about trade anyway. It's also, of course, about flows of capital, flows of people, which we're going to talk about, which are still enormous and voluminous. And especially if you start to, again, look at digital services, you find that there is more connectivity than ever. I'm going to show you some more data around this. So when we talk about trade wars, in this almost rhetorical way, as if the world is being plunged into another round of trade wars that could spark geopolitical conflict. That may indeed happen. But let's look at it differently. Let's instead understand that we are already in a kind of struggle, a tug of war, as I call it, every single day. We don't have to wait for some future trade war. Countries right now are very actively engaged in a tug of war over this connectivity, which is very lucrative, very profitable. It's for the control of global supply chains and the value added in those global value chain networks. It's happening all the time. And you can see, for example, with this Venn diagram, you can see the debate about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has just been exited by the United States. People have said that the United States' lack of interest in moving forward with the TPP trade negotiation means the end of globalization. Well, that's not true. Because in fact, if you look at the countries in the middle colored green, all of those countries were simultaneously part of the negotiations with China over the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. And many of the countries that were involved in TPP are now going to move forward with their own bilateral or interregional negotiations. Canada is negotiating a free trade agreement. with China, for example. The so-called Pacific Alliance countries of Latin America are increasing their trade liberalization agreements with Asian countries. So trade continues to advance in different ways. It doesn't have to be one global agreement at any given time. It can be many, many smaller agreements, and that's what is playing out. And that is, again, a struggle to control the value from connectivity, not to switch it on and off. And that's why we need to understand that globalization is still a very robust phenomenon. Societies are getting more and more connected. But now what is happening is a tension to control the value from that connectivity, not to reverse globalization, which still, by and large, benefits almost everyone. I mentioned, again now, the digital dimension. You may know that there are more than 300 or 350 submarine internet cables that many of them are layered upon the old telegraph networks from the 19th century. And these are being laid down at an ever higher volume. Not a month goes by when you don't hear that Microsoft or Facebook or Google has laid down a new cable across one of the oceans. There's going to be cables over the Arctic Sea and so forth. Every continent is building more and more digital connectivity to each other in order to advance the flows of capital, the flows of data, knowledge, ideas, bandwidth so that people can communicate through social media. There is obviously immense economic value to those transactions. We actually find it hard to geographically isolate exactly where value creation happens and who exactly profits when and how from this enormous volume of digital connectivity. But it is growing and growing and growing. And that too speaks to the increasing liquidness, if you will, of borders. So too does the movement of people. It is also very fashionable today to talk about walls going up, borders going up, migration and retreat, except it is not true. There are more expatriates today, more people living outside of their country of origin, nearly 300 million people, which of course tragically includes more than 50 million refugees, than ever in human history. And the majority of human migration is not people trying to move to Europe, to the continent, to the region where there is most certainly a backlash against immigration that is going on. The majority of migration in the world is across emerging markets, across developing countries. And here you can see on this map every single large-scale flow of people across continents. You can see that that the largest zone of cross-border migration in the world is within Africa. And last year, the heads of state of all African governments got together and declared that they would move towards a visa-free zone by the year 2020. Right? So that's about more than 1 billion people who are committing to bringing down borders between their countries. The same thing happened last year actually in Southeast Asia, a region of more than 700 million people. So in the last 1 year alone, 2 billion people represented by their governments have said that we want to bring down walls, bring down borders, have more ease of mobility for workers, for students, for travelers, not to put up walls and barriers and restrictions. So yes, it is happening in some places. In some places, walls are being built. Walls are being stiffened. Policies around immigration are changing. But in many, many parts of the world, things are going in a more liquid, more open direction. And again, it's because people see the complementarity that is derived from having knowledge workers move to one part of the world, send remittances back home, and so forth. Of course, we're standing here in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. What country in the world and what city has benefited more in the last generation from this mobility of labor? This is, in fact, one of the fastest growing cities ever. And its infrastructural connectivity, right? The airport, the transportation systems, the logistics, the shipping, and also its openness to the mobility of people has been a crucial factor in the success and is why we are standing here today. Let's look at just a few geographic instances of how this growing infrastructure connectivity across borders is changing the nature of relations between countries. And the most obvious example is the case of Europe. Over the last more than half century, since the creation of the European coal and steel community to today's European Union, the European Union is not a very strong, powerful political institution right now. It seems like it's on its back legs. But what Europe, as a commonwealth of states, has done is to build this, and this is just the oil and gas network of Western Europe that you can see here, that is helped to redistribute large volumes of energy supply around the continent. So what you have is a situation where if you take, for example, Angela Merkel's statement from 2011 after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, that Germany would go non-nuclear and phase out its nuclear power industry. In fact, even when it does so, it will still be importing nuclear power from France. So in fact, just like the Eurozone currency itself has proven to outlast many of the skeptics, it's still there. Countries have not left the Eurozone. Similarly, there are other dimensions, such as energy supply and sharing of energy, that show you that not only the currency egg cannot be unscrambled, but also, in a way, the energy egg cannot be unscrambled. And Europe is doing more and more to share energy together. That's changing relations between countries. Perhaps the most significant geography in which to explore this is the eastern half of the Eurasian landmass. Some would call it Greater China. China has more neighbors than any country in the world, 14 neighbors. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union 25 years ago, it has begun to accelerate its efforts to build infrastructures. On this map, you can see highways, railways, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, electricity grids, and so forth, that China is investing in through the One Belt, One Road scheme, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and others, to, in a way, pave across, to connect across all of its borders, and to unite the Eurasian landmass. Now, I mentioned earlier that Europe's trade volume with Asia, across the world's largest landmass, with the world's largest population, is already greater than Europe's trade relationship with its closest ally, the United States. And that's before many of the lines on this map are actually even built. Many of them are there. For the last 25 years, China has already invested so much in this, and now it is going to accelerate further and further. So borders are becoming more liquid because of this connectivity, because China has invested so much in these economies and become their largest trading partner, their largest foreign investor. There's more growing Chinese populations in these countries. The entire economics of the Eurasian landmass is changing as a result of just this one phenomenon of infrastructure investment across this landmass. And it is going to play out even faster in the last 25 years than it has, in the next 25 years than it has in the last 25. Let's look at, of course, this region of the world, the Middle East. Now, never has a region been as ripe for disruption through using infrastructure as a tool of progress, if you will. Because, in fact, bringing together the themes that I've talked about so far, the Arab world is the most urbanized region of the world. The 400 million people who live on this map mostly live in cities. And of course, tragically, we've experienced so much state failure. Particularly since the Arab Spring, but it's a cumulative phenomenon, really, over the last several decades, in which countries are failing. So you cannot understand or explain what the future of the Arab world will be simply by looking at the post-colonial boundaries that in many ways are so fragile, so weak, that in many cases don't even exist. What you have to understand is the ways in which, again, some of these infrastructures, the electricity grids, the highway networks, the railways, are being invested in today to set the foundation for a new Arab future in which Arab societies, Arab cities are more and more connected to each other. And that is going to help this entire region optimize its land, its labor, and its capital much better than the post-colonial map of national boundaries has done. Again, there will always be nations and boundaries. There will be more nations than ever before, potentially, with the birth of new states. Just to take a brief aside, when the United Nations was founded in 1945, it had 51 original members. Today it has 200. So we have more states, we have more nations, we have more boundaries than ever before. But we also are building more connectivity across them, because the smaller and smaller a country becomes, the less autarkic it can be, the less it can be self-reliant. The more it depends on building infrastructure and connectivity across boundaries to get the resources that it needs. And so I do have some hope in the long term for this region. Let me look at Southeast Asia as well briefly. I mentioned earlier that there are 700 million people living in Southeast Asia. They too have invested massively now in railways, in pipelines, and electricity grids, taking these 10, 12 countries of Southeast Asia and becoming ever more one economic unit. There is no one country in Southeast Asia, certainly not Indonesia or Vietnam, that can compete with China when it comes to its economy or to even attracting the volumes of foreign investment that China does. But together, these countries, the ASEAN countries, do attract more foreign investment every year than all of China does. And their GDP is larger than India's GDP, with half the population. That's the power of connecting supply chains across borders and increasing the mobility of people across borders, as this region is very, very pragmatically doing. So a final couple of points. The way I see the geometry of the future in a world in which you have growing connectivity is that, and in a world in which every continent is becoming important, what you see here is that we're not moving into a world where there is only one superpower. Right? We're moving into a world, in fact, that is multi-regional. Yes, the United States will always have a preponderant military capacity, more than any other country in the world. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, if you look at the full set of issues, the demographic gravity, the role in global trade networks, and the size of economies, you see that every region of the world has become important. The Middle East is important, Africa is important, South America is important, and they're increasingly connecting more and more to each other. So I see the world becoming much more symmetrical rather than hierarchical. No one can stop any region of the world from trading and connecting and developing stronger ties with any other part of the world. That's precisely what has been happening since the end of the Cold War, and that is what is going to continue. I view that as a broadly positive development. Let me end with one final slide. Especially relevant, I think, for us here sitting in the Middle East, an area, a region whose role in the world economy has traditionally been defined by its participation in energy markets, by the sale of oil and gas to other regions. We have historically, or in the modern world, thought about one pivotal trigger of conflict in geopolitics being disruptions of energy supplies. So I've put on this map are the red dots are the main maritime choke points in this hemisphere of the world for the flow of oil and gas. The Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz, the Straits of Malacca. What is happening now with all of this infrastructure investment and connectivity is that the supply of energy, the supply of oil and gas can meet the demand for that energy in multiple pathways, over the Arctic, through the trans-Eurasian corridors, and in other ways. So this means that even if there is a supply disruption, even if there is a geopolitical conflict in one very sensitive or volatile part of the world, it doesn't mean that the flows of energy stop. And the way in which we prevent any one issue, whether it is a conflict or whether it is a disruption in oil flows, from causing war, is that we build the connectivity around it so that supply can meet demand. And that's what building infrastructure, making borders more liquid does. It helps to optimize the flows of these precious resources that we all depend on. And so to me, if we can continue to invest in this infrastructure, if we can continue to build this connectivity, we are going to wind up building a more resilient world, a better global civilization. So this is the future that I hope we can move towards, but it's not up to me alone just to talk about it. It's up to everyone in this room to actually go out and build it. Thank you very much.